now, and thank you so much for being with us, and welcome.
Thank you very much, Sally, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I've got to say, for me, you know, I give presentations like this reasonably frequently, and very often they're just one-off events, and so the conversations that start never get picked up on, and it feels a real privilege to come back and share with you a bit further and to toss some of these ideas around, because, you know, I feel as though I'm just scratching the surface so often, and it's just lovely to have the opportunity to really kind of flesh some of these ideas out. So what I'd like to do today is partly recap a little bit on what we did last time, and also expand on that and give you a little bit more granular detail of what I'm talking about, some other examples, and explore this idea of what nature actually is. And, you know, very often we think of nature as being a place. You know, it's somewhere that we go to walk the dog, or to go for a nice walk or a hike, or we go camping or fishing or something like this. It's very much, you know, we think of it as a physical place. And we acknowledge that there are species that live in that place, and that place represents what we call an ecosystem, which is a bit of a mysterious thing, but the scientists know all about it because they study it. And essentially, what we're thinking of nature is it's a noun, it's a thing. And what I'm realizing is that nature is not a thing, it's not an object. Nature is a process. In other words, it's a verb. Nature is an interaction, an interconnection, a set of relationships between species which all impinge on each other. And as I said last time, that process is self-organizing, self-sustaining, and it leads to the continuance of life. So we're looking at very much something that is a system in movement. It's dynamic, it's flowing, it has balances, and it has reciprocities and interactions. So what I would encourage you to think of nature in more than anything else is an active system. It's not a place, and it's not a thing. So what I'd like to do is just spin out some of this awareness, because it's very tricky for us as Westerners to get hold of. We tend to think of nature and land as being something that we own. And so to get it out of our heads that it isn't something that we own, but it's something that we are a part of. It's not something that we manage. It's not something that we take resources from or whatever. I mean, it is in a strict sense in some ways, but more than anything else, it's a living, dynamic system that we are a part of. And the reason that sound is so important to me is because sound tells you what's going on. Sound is dynamic. It happens in the moment. It's ephemeral. And it tells you about interactions between particular species or between individuals of the same species. And so I like to think of it that it's like the bush is telling you stories. It's telling you stories about what's going on. And to decode those stories, you have to learn the language of the bush and the language of the storytellers. And I'll do that hopefully in a moment. But it's interesting when I hear Indigenous people speak, because they are constantly communicating the law in terms of stories. And it seems to me that what nature is doing is, in telling us stories, it's telling us its law. So when we're listening to nature, we are listening to the law of our biosphere. And that law is there whether we acknowledge it or not. It is a fact of our existence. So to listen to it and to learn from it is probably the most deeply human thing that we can possibly do. So let's do a little bit of listening, and I thought what I would do is replay the recording that I started last time with, and I'm joining you from Djadjarung country in central Victoria, so this is a recording from where I live. So once again, this is a spectrogram, and I introduced these last time, but they're a visual representation of what you're hearing, so you can actually see some of the structures of the sound. So once again, just have a listen, immerse yourself in this. You might recall it from last time. And at the end, I'm going to talk you through what I'm hearing in this 1 minute of audio. I don't know how many times I've played that for people, but every time I listen to it, it's just, to see the spectrogram and to listen to it again, it's just lovely. So let's stick with the spectrogram. And what I've done here is colour in each of the different species so that we can recognise the voices. And I'm just going to describe what I'm hearing, what I'm understanding about what I'm hearing. So the first thing that we have here is the shining bronze cuckoo, this series of upslurred whistles. And the shining bronze cuckoo is it's a parasitic breeder, so it doesn't have a home range that it lives in. It'll move around an area. And what it's doing here is it is advertising its presence in the landscape. So it needs a call which is very clear and carries over a big distance. Now you're talking about a bird that is pretty small. And what you're seeing on the spectrogram here is that this bird is singing single frequency of sound. There's no frequencies above or below it. It's just singing a single pure note, in this case upslurred. And I think of this a little bit like a laser. You know, a laser is coherent light. What this bird is doing is singing a pure sound, it's coherent sound, and it's putting all its energy into that one frequency to push it out across a landscape. And you can hear these birds from up to a kilometre away. That's pretty impressive for a little animal that's very, very small. The Scarlet Robin over here, it does have a home range that it lives on, and this is its home range call. It's a very simple little phrase which it will repeat over and over again. And from the distance that I've recorded this from, it just sounds like a little ripple of sound. When you get closer to it, that phrase consists of a couple of little whistled notes, and in the middle, it's got a really hard little trill. It's sort of like a, I can't do this quickly, but it's sort of a, there's just this little in the middle of it. Now that sound decays very quickly in the atmosphere. It doesn't carry far in the atmosphere, but the whistled notes do. So from the distance that we're hearing it here, you just hear those whistled notes, and they will carry over half a kilometre or so. Once again, pure frequencies, one single frequency. But the trill degrades very quickly. And so what this bird is doing is it is able to hear the song of its neighbour And by recognizing the difference between its own song, which it knows at source, what it sounds like, they all sing exactly the same phrase, it's able to judge the distance, how far away it is from its neighbour, by hearing that little trill part and how much it's degraded. So it's able to range distance by having this little sonic component in its call. So what it's doing is it's sitting in the middle of its home range and it's singing, and its neighbour can say, well, look, you're over there and I'm over here, and we know how far away each other we are. And many birds, you find these, they're called transients, very fine elements of the audio in their calls that degrade fairly quickly, so that they can measure how far away they are from each other. The white-throated tree creeper, once again, it has a very range of calls, but you can see that this is once again a pure single frequency. By contrast, the sulphur-crested cockatoos and the corellas are not singing single frequencies. And although they're way off in the distance and it looks like a kind of smudge of sound here, when you hear them close up, you realise it's incredibly complex sonic detail in their vocalisations. Both corellas and cockatoos are highly intelligent animals, and they are social animals, and in their communications, the complexity of the sound reflects the complexity of their societies. So they're actually able to recognise each other as individuals by the sound of their voice, and probably recognise a lot of other inference about their state of being through the quality of sound. They have, once again, a great range of different vocalisations. So you're hearing a species that is more concerned with sociality than it is about just pushing sound out across the landscape. Weebills, we just flick past them, have a mixture of contact calls and their characteristic weebill call. They're kind of calling their name. The rufous whistler, also single pure frequencies, a very varied repertoire. They really are quite virtuosic. The grey shrike thrush, equally, I'll come back to the grey thrush later on, but it has beautiful, rich tonal calls. A mixture, you can see here, there is some tonal frequency specific calls, and then you have this rattle on the end, which is right across the frequency band. The brown-headed honeyeater equally has quite a wide frequency band. It's almost like a chatter, whereas the spotted pardalote, a very small little bird, is communicating using, once again, the sonic laser, single frequency. Down the bottom here, the common bronze-winged pigeon, you can see it's got a very low frequency call, and there are a couple of harmonics on top of that. I'll come to that in a moment, the significance of harmonics. But for a bronzewing, I mean, you're a big fat dinner for a goshawk, and you're sitting up in a tree and you're advertising, hey, pigeon here, come and get me. Pigeons and doves all across the world sing notes that are way below the pitch that you would expect them to sing for their body size. A common bronzewing is about the same size as a magpie, but it sings about 2 octaves below what you would expect a bird of that size to call. And the reason that they do this, and if you've ever been around bronzewing pigeons, or indeed many pigeons, when they call so low, they're almost ventriloquial. It is really hard to work out where that sound is coming from. It might be close and it might be quite loud, but it's really difficult to localize where that sound is coming from. And it's a factor of the physics of the sound, that a low frequency sine wave, just a simple pure tone, is very hard for the ear to localize where it is. So this is how they avoid predation, is by having a call that is difficult to localize. Now, I mentioned harmonics. Here's the Australian raven, and you see here it has a stack of sounds. It's not just one single frequency, but a series of what are called overtones. This is very characteristic of mammalian voices. Mammals put a lot of emotional expression and a lot of intelligence into their vocalizations. And we have a range of harmonics. Indeed, in our voices, all the vowel sounds that I'm using are manipulations of these higher resonances in my voice. So the Australian raven, when you hear a raven, you're actually hearing not only a creature that uses sound very similarly to the way that we do, a very similar sound. And I think that's why we really relate to the raven. We hear that, oh, and it just kind of like, oh yeah, that speaks to us. But once again, we're talking about a very intelligent animal, and they have a spectral complexity to the sound that reflects that. Crinia segnifera, the frog, I'm going to play you a little bit more of those later on and hear some more corellas in the background and see, once again, this stack of harmonics in the corella call. They don't always have that. Sometimes it's more a harsh, just a screech, but here it's more a yap. So, the yellow robin, equally pure notes. Up here, superb fairy wren. It's creating very high frequency, very short duration calls. Now, by contrast with the low frequency tonal calls that the pigeon makes, superb fairy wrens, they want to be found because this is a contact call, and this is how they keep their little family party together, is by constantly having these little high frequency, they're often very splintered, quite textured calls, rich in transients. So these high frequency calls, little kind of sounds, are really good for the ear to localize exactly where. So a bird can hear the other members of its family, and they don't have to see where they are in the underbrush. They can hear exactly where they are and keep in touch with each other. So this is a contact call. Magpies, they're a bit off in the distance, so they're a bit smudged, but they have a highly complex call with tonal as well as ranging notes, the same as the magpie, the Scarlet Robin has, and the magpie-like finally. So there's just some of the life stories and the lifestyles of the individuals that you can hear in this little 1 minute of audio. But I'm not only hearing a collection of species, I'm hearing their interactions in the landscape. And so I could say, well, first of all, it's not a dawn chorus because it's quite varied and creatures are moving around, birds are moving around. So, but there's a lot of activity, so it's probably about 8 or 9 in the morning. There's a cuckoo calling. They've called very predominantly in the early spring, so I'd say it's probably something like October, November in this part of the world. I can also tell you that you're hearing a mixture of, for instance, the weebill is a canopy feeder, so there's probably trees, canopied trees around. The fairy wren is a ground story feeder, so there's probably some shrubs and an understory, reasonably well developed understory. You heard a crinia earlier on, that probably indicates there's some standing water. But in the background, you're getting magpies, magpie-like, corellas, cockatoos, all these are open country birds. So it's probably not a woodland habitat solely. There's probably some open country nearby as well. So it's a mosaic landscape. And because of the biodiversity, it's a reasonably healthy landscape. So I'm getting all of that from 1 minute of soundscape, 1 minute of audio. So this is the way that I'm listening to the natural world, that it's telling me stories about individual creatures, the way that they live, the way that they interact, and how that all fits together as a living system. Now, last time I played you some recordings, I spoke about the sentience of individual creatures and played you a few examples of that. And then moved on to thinking about cooperation and how sound facilitates processes that are mutually beneficial in an ecosystem. And the examples I picked were the feeding flocks, which are found in tropical forests, and also we get them down here in temperate Australia. And I spoke a little bit about the dawn chorus, and I'd just like to expand on the dawn chorus theme a little bit and play you some recordings of this bird. It's a grey shrike thrush, which we've just heard. And the grey thrush is, you know, if you have them living around your home, you'll know they are beautiful songbirds, very rich, full-bodied voices. We have one that lives near our house that actually nests in our carport. And we have them right across the landscape. There's another one that has a home range about a couple of 100 metres away. And I felt they were doing something. I couldn't put my finger on it. So I put the microphones out over several mornings and recorded the dawn chorus just to see what these thrushes were doing. So that they're doing something. And I found that of all the phrases that they have in their repertoire, and they have many, many different phrases. Sometimes they'll sit on one for 5 minutes and then they'll change to another one. But they have many different phrases that they will sing throughout the day. But in the dawn, they were not only doing this counter singing of alternating backwards and forwards, but they were singing, each bird in the landscape was singing exactly the same phrase. So here you'll hear the bird that is close to our home, which is this one, and you'll hear its neighbour a few 100 metres away, and they're both singing exactly the same phrase. And it carried on like this for maybe 20 minutes or so. And then suddenly the neighbouring bird changed the phrase. And straight away our bird picked up the new phrase and began singing that. And they both continued, once again, singing the same phrase. It's a little bit difficult to hear the one in the distance. I hope you can hear it. Anyway, this went on for, once again, another 10 minutes or so, and then something interesting happened. By this time, the whole local thrush community were all singing in the dawn chorus, and one of the birds in the distance changed the song, changed to a new phrase. And our bird heard the new phrase and immediately changed to it. But the neighbouring bird didn't hear the phrase and continued with the old one. And our home bird kind of did a bit of double take. Well, which one are we doing then? And it went back to the old phrase. But by that stage, the neighbour had heard the new phrase and picked up on that. Oh, right, so we are changing to the new one. And they all congregated around the new phrase. And by this time, with the dawn chorus winding down, you can hear probably about 4 or 5 different thrushes within, say, a radius of 1 kilometre that are all singing the same phrase. So this is almost bordering on a kind of thrush culture going on here. This is really fascinating that they are interacting with each other in a way that, if I could put a kind of human interpretation on this, they are kind of recognising each other and they are acknowledging each other. And the thing is that this alternation, this counter singing of giving each other space and giving each other the kind of, respect is not quite the right word, but giving each other space in the landscape, in their community of creatures, is something that I've heard frequently with birds. It's really the way that the dawn chorus actually works, but it's not just birds that do it. Here is, once again, this is a recording from, this is just outside our front door. This is the pond at the front of our house. And these are two Crinia frogs. You've just heard them on the earlier recording, Crinia signifera. One frog starts, and then the second frog locks in between the calls of the first frog to create this alternating backwards and forwards. And it is so tightly orchestrated. Just have a listen to this. It's just extraordinary, just how synchronized they are. And this is how frogs generally call. They will call in alternating. When there's a big community of frogs in a pond, the group that are close to each other will create this alternation across the whole pond. It'll just create this wall of sound which can attract other breeding partners from further water bodies further away, which creates a diversity in the gene pool. So it's a very cleverly worked out way of both broadcasting oneself as an individual whilst actually doing something cooperative for the whole species. And you see this across the natural world. Sally, can I just get a time from you, because I wasn't quite sure when I actually started. So how much time have I got to?
You've got about 6 more minutes.
Hi. Okay. Well, look, I'm just going to really very quickly finish off with a few things here. Some overview of how natural systems work. Predation and competition, we often think of these as being the foundation of natural systems. And there is a difference between the two. Predation is where an individual animal will utilize another animal as a resource. In other words, one animal will ingest another one. Competition, by contrast, is where two individuals, they may be of the same species or different species, they utilize the same resource. And last time I gave some examples of how eloquently nature works around that process. But I'll just spend a minute or two talking about predation, because very often we think of predation as a kind of exploitative and violent aspect of nature. If you've seen this particular graphic before, the difference between the anthropocentric on the left-hand side and the ecological view of natural systems, you'll notice that the anthropocentric one is, it very much mimics the kind of biology that I was taught as a child, that you know, simple animals at the bottom of the food chain leading upwards through more complex animals to humans at the top. And generally, you know, the higher predators as well, like whales. But there's a fair amount of bias in this. I mean, sharks we don't like very much, or snakes, so we put them down the bottom, despite the fact that in many ecosystems they are apex predators as well. So we have this pyramidal hierarchical structure of what predation is, and it leads to farmers saying, well, look, if I get rid of insects out of my field, it'll be better for the plants, and it leads to fishermen saying, well, if I get rid of dolphins and seals, it'll mean more fish. In actual fact, it doesn't work like that. And what ecologists have been discovering over recent years is that when you take apex predators out of an ecosystem, the whole ecosystem goes slightly belly up. So predation is not only, it does several things. Firstly, predation leads to biodiversity. In ecosystems that have predators in it, particularly apex predators, is a system that is regulated. And it's more biodiverse than if you take them out. And the example of this is from Yellowstone National Park in the early 1900s. In 1920, wolves were hunted out of Yellowstone, and they weren't present until 80 years later when they were reintroduced. And what they discovered was that it wasn't just the predator and prey interactions, the entire, not only the ecosystem changed, the actual landscape changed because one of these keystone species was reintroduced. And this graphic just very quickly shows it. The top predators had become coyotes, which didn't predate on elk. So the elk numbers just grew out of all proportion. They ate the streamside vegetation, that muddied the waters, and the rivers just became inhospitable to fish. The coyotes hunted beavers, which meant that the beaver dams weren't there. When they reintroduced the the wolves predated on the elk, and it wasn't so much that they ate the numbers down or anything, it's that the elk became more cautious. They no longer grazed on the open areas by the water. They retreated back to near the safety of the forests. So they would graze away from the riverbanks, which meant that the vegetation grew up, the water cleared, the beavers came back, the wolves created carcasses for scavengers, bird life came back, the whole ecosystem changed, and the courses of the rivers started changing as well. So the importance of having predation in the landscape is that it not only creates biodiversity, but it then regulates all of that biodiversity. But there is a third consequence of predation, and that is that it creates complexity, and one of those complexities is intelligence. And we mentioned this lovely little creature earlier on. This is probably one of our most controversial native songbirds, the noisy miner. And the sociality of noisy miners and the complexity of their interactions and the nuance and the intelligence of their interactions is quite extraordinary. This is a very brief recording of probably one of the most annoying sounds in the Australian landscape, but it is actually a community of noisy miners who are alerting each other to a danger. And you can hear how they are collectively creating this sort of wall of sound as they mob and give their alarm calls. So I think I might just leave it there, Sally, and I was going to talk a little bit more about competition. I might just throw in a few things if I've got 1 minute.
Sure.
Just to start a conversation, really, apart from anything else. We often think competition is something that's intrinsic in nature, it's necessary. And yet this idea, it's very often credited to this lovely fellow. This is Charles Darwin, of course. And the summation of his ideas in this, the survival of the fittest. Darwin never said this. The idea comes from this fellow. His name is Herbert Spencer. He was a philosopher in Victorian England. He picked up on Charles Darwin's ideas because he felt that it justified his colonial interpretation of the superiority of the English man. He was a misogynist, he was a racist, he was an apologist for colonialism, and his works were extraordinarily popular to the extent that he really popularised the concept of evolution, and it got wound up with the concepts of not just the superiority of European culture, but the superiority of European ideas about land, wealth and ownership. So when we look at competition in the natural world, as I was talking about later, and I won't have time to go into now, there are a lot of, we have a lot of decolonialising of our interpretation of nature and our interpretation of the natural world and how it functions. So that can be a theme that we can chat about as well.
How does his understanding of how these beings are reacting to the presence of humans?
It depends very much on the species. It depends on their evolutionary history as to whether they've been hunted. For instance, we have wallabies on our property, and there's one wallaby that's kind of getting used to me. I walk past it every morning, it kind of looks at me. There's that big, tall creature walking past on two legs again, but it's pretty wary of me. And of course, you know, macropods have been hunted in this country for tens of thousands of years, so I don't blame it. And of course, from its point of view, it's looking at me and going, well, you could be a predator that might attack me. You're a kind of the right size, and I'll think I'd better hop away. Whereas other creatures are maybe not so concerned. It very much depends on the animal as to whether it perceives you as a threat or not.
Thanks, Andrew. And I noticed there's a couple of questions to do with cooperating as well as competition. So perhaps you could expand a little bit more on both of those. Like how, you know, there's one question about lichen is a cooperation of two life forms. So how do you see that happening?
Yeah, look, it happens all across the animal world. And there's a question here, did Darwin have a more integrated view of evolution than survival of the fittest? Absolutely, he did. He was a very keen naturalist, a very patient observer. And he was trying to understand not just the ecosystem, but where we fitted into it. And that's why I'm saying, you know, it's Herbert Spencer that really characterized his ideas as survival of the fittest. He was very uncomfortable with it. So yeah, he saw things more as a non-hierarchical set of interaction, more that web of life that we understand. Sorry, Sally, you just said something at the beginning and it's gone out of my head.
About collaboration between species and also the competition versus competition.
Yeah, mutualisms. Mutualisms are very often, we think of two species that have a mutual interaction with each other. And sometimes it is kind of isolated to just two species, but very often those relationships form the absolute foundations of entire ecosystems. So without those mutualisms, let me see whether this was something I was going to go on and talk a bit about. So if I just share my screen again, and I'll pop the sound on and see if I can pick up my presentation and just talk about it very briefly. So this is a photograph of mycorrhizal fungi, and they form a mutualistic relationship with the roots of plants, whereby the fungi are much smaller than the roots, and so they can actually extract nutrients and moisture from the soil and feed those back to the roots, and by reciprocally the roots supply sugars to the fungi. So this is an absolutely fundamental mutualistic relationship. There are about 90% of the world's plants that rely on this relationship to happen. Then there's pollination. Pollination evolved, plants, flowering plants evolved maybe around 120 million years ago. And they arose alongside the pollinators. So social bees, wasps arose at the same time. This bird is a broad-tailed hummingbird, probably evolved a little bit later, but nevertheless, pollination as part of the animal kingdom supports an extraordinary range of different species which pollinate an extraordinary range of plants. So once again, if we took all that biodiversity out by virtue of not having this mutualistic relationship of pollination, the world would be vastly poorer. And it's not just flowering plants, seeding and fruiting plants. This is a lovely close-up photograph of a cassowary poo. Cassowaries, large flightless birds in our tropical forests and throughout the Asian region. There are about 200 rainforest trees that require their seeds to go through the digestive tract of a cassowary to germinate. So these cassowaries are really a keystone species in tropical forests because they have a mutualistic relationship with the trees, whereby they propagate and they move around the seeds of the trees. And this is, you know, once again, you're talking about ecosystems that are very ancient. So this is a process that you can say has a long evolutionary history, and it's absolutely at the foundation of the ecosystem. That germination of new plants is absolutely foundational. This is a grey currawong. This is photographed on our place. So this is the temperate woodlands. It's feeding on the seeds, or the fruits rather, of a cherry ballard. And the seeds go into the digestive tract of the bird, and then the bird will hack up a sort of a pellet and containing the fruits and seeds. And once again, without that process, cherry ballards and other fruiting trees, there aren't an awful lot of them in this part of the world, but those fruiting trees that the bird eats at various times in the year require that mutualistic relationship to happen. So it's absolutely foundational to ecosystems, and it's, you know, it's extraordinarily, I haven't really got the superlatives for it. It's not just individual species that are having these, they're kind of foundational relationships. And you find them in marine ecosystems really fundamentally. As a matter of fact, you could say that multicellular life, I think it was Lynn Margolis, the scientist in the 1980s, proposed this idea that multicellular animals evolved because a single-celled animal ingested another single-celled animal, which became a sort of, I forget the word for it now, but it's kind of an inclusion within the body of the single-celled animal. And so the whole concept of the flowering of life into multicellular creatures essentially is a kind of mutualistic relationships between elements within single cells. So we are living examples of mutualism, and of course our microflora in our gut and so on is another example. It just goes on and on. And my generalization about all of this is that competition exists in the natural world, but by and large, nature finds the most extraordinary ways of minimizing the detrimental effects of competition. It finds ways that creatures live mutually alongside each other without necessarily competing, even though they're using the same resources. And then in the most fundamental and widespread ways, mutualistic cooperative relationships are the foundations of mature ecosystems. And as ecosystems evolve and develop, they go through a successional process. That complexity and the depth of those interactions magnifies. You may not get it when an ecosystem first starts rebuilding itself, like a reef after a tropical storm or the bush after a bad fire, but you will find it where ecosystems have had enough time for that succession process to develop that complexity. So,
Andrew, there are a number of questions around biodiversity in urban areas and how can this be practiced, as well as lamenting that often diversity is not able to coexist.
I think it's a question that, thank you, Marie. I think it's sorry, Margie. It's a question that we're going to have to get our heads around, and it's a wonderful topic, because to rewild our living spaces, to me, it just sounds like the most fun thing to do. And I don't know whether those of you have seen it, but there is a webcam set up on a peregrine falcon's nest currently in the middle of Melbourne. This is a really great example. Here you've got an apex predator, you know, sorting out the pigeons and various other small things. And you know, it's something that we can all share in and observe. And so I think there are a lot of innovative things that we can do in terms of rebuilding habitat. It needs to have shelter for animals. It needs to have opportunities for them. It needs to have food sources. And as we understand more about how ecosystems are structured in terms of keystone species, we can be thinking about either introducing species or attracting them back from the countryside. So to me, it's just, this is the kind of wonderful projects that we can move towards. And coming back to Indigenous thinking, I was in a webinar earlier on this morning with Tyson Yunkaporta, who many of you will have heard of from his book Sand Talk. And he was basically saying that, you know, what we need to be is the custodial species. And so this is where rewilding comes into its own, that we have a job not just of sustainability, which has become a word that's kind of got co-opted by corporations now, but we need to be thinking about regenerative practices, both in agriculture and in living ecosystems in our urban spaces, and also for us as individuals. We need to regenerate ourselves as people who feel alive, connected, engaged with the world around us. And there is so much that disconnects us in our modern world, in our, you know, from earning a living to the kind of stresses that we put ourselves under. What a wonderful question. Look, these sessions, you know, that we've had feel too short to me. It just feels like we're opening up some things, and I'd love to have more engagement with you all. I think the thing for me is that we all have different beliefs, and those beliefs are really important. You know, science reveals a lot of evidence-based information, but it doesn't tell us really how to live. There is no moral compass in the knowledge that science reveals. So we need to find that within our hearts. And it seems to me for all of you to be coming together from your various perspectives and to be sharing that it's not only inspiring, but I would say it's really brave, because our beliefs allow us to be in the world. Our beliefs shape our actions and our presence in the world. And so when you start thinking about reflecting on your beliefs and expanding your beliefs and nurturing and developing them, it's like you're looking at the toolkit that you bring to life, and you're saying, well, is this the right tool? Is this really going to take me to where, you know, how I want to be and what I want to contribute to the world? And so it's a very brave thing to be reviewing one's beliefs in that context. And you can see people that have rigid beliefs, and it's like they're scared of change. They don't want to go there. And I think for you folks to be as curious and as open as you are is inspiring for me to see, and just the diversity of your ideas and where you're coming from. It's wonderful. So I really appreciate the opportunity to share time with you.